Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about early childhood development. The entire time I was recording this, I kept asking myself, do we ever grow out of this stage? Or is it just an ongoing, continuing process that occurs throughout the lifespan? So maybe I'll use that as a theme to discuss throughout this lecture. All right, so the book breaks it down into a Piagetian approach to early childhood development or looking at a Vygotskian approach to childhood development. So we'll start out with Piaget and self-regulation. Again, the main first half of this chapter really focuses on our behavior and emotional development along with our cognitive development. And again, these two theories generally account for a lot of that. So regarding Piaget and self-regulation, the developmental task of early childhood, again, these stage theories is initiative versus guilt. And you guys have heard my critiques about stage theories, but again, there are some universal common developmental processes that just coincide with the actual structure of the brain growing, for example. So not only are we discussing the neuroscience of the brain and how the brain structures and the neural pathways develop and memory schemas start to be formed, but we're also talking about the social context and what's going on here and how is that structuring our behavior. And so one of the early tasks is this idea of initiative versus guilt. Initiative, in the harshest way to say it, is either kids go out in the world and they start to figure it out, or they don't, and that kind of starts to stunt their development because they're not getting the skills that they need. Um, the goal of this stage is to learn to plan and achieve goals while interacting with others. Preschool children can master this task. Again, if you just watch kids at play, you see it. They set goals, they create games, they go out and do all of these things. They try to use the objects in the social context. They're using language to interact with each other. Again, this process of being able to engage in play and using language, again, from babies on up, this takes many years. It takes many years of social interaction where we're socializing our children to learn these skills. We're teaching them the languages that we're going to be using, the grammar and the syntax and the rules. And a lot of this they'll pick up naturally. But again, what effect does the social context have on them? And we can look at things like we looked at last week with parenting styles. How is parenting styles associated with initiative? Are children given a chance to go out and explore and experiment creatively in the social context? Are they completely structured and disciplined in a way that they don't have that creativity? How does that create divergent and convergent developmental, like I want to say linear lines, or something along those lines? But again, like a transition, or no, that's not even the right word. Traction, that's not the right word either. What would you call that? I don't even know. But again, that idea that, how does the social context affect our, there's a T word. I know what it's there. I'm going to come back to that later because it's going to drive me crazy. What do you call that? Yeah, who knows? I'll think about it later. Those who are unsuccessful at this stage with their initiative misfiring or stifled by over-controlling parents, for example, may develop feelings of inadequacy and guilt. And so again, during this stage, it's important that kids uh, explore and be able to engage in the social context. And then what happens if they're not able to? How is your parenting styles associated with whether or not they develop feelings of competency and believe in their ability to do it? Or are they nervous and scared and hesitant and feel guilty because they haven't achieved those goals, for example? So, regarding behavioral self regulation refers broadly to the self control individuals use to modify their actions. And again, at what point do children have the ability to even begin to think about engaging in behavioral self regulation? And the book points to about two, when, that's when it really starts to solidify. But if you go back, babies are learning to do this. They're learning to get on a schedule. They're learning to cry at specific times. They're learning to go to sleep at specific times. They're starting to learn the patterns of the culture and the context in which they're being raised. Self-regulation refers to learning the do's and the don'ts. Okay, again, so over time, how do we structure kids? Yes, that's great job. No, don't do that. That's not safe. Don't do that. Yes, do that. That's the proper way. Again, by kind of guiding them and directing them into appropriate behaviors, we are teaching them the skills that they need to be able to get around in society. And along with those skills come things like being able to manage your behavior to meet the expectations of the culture in which you are raised. So, from a very early age, we are structuring children, agents of socialization, parents, peers, family members, the education system, whatever it might be, into these do's and don'ts so that kids learn enough self regulation and emotional regulation so that they can function in the social context in such a way that it doesn't deviate from social norms too much that it might cause them problems. Um, in order to have that behavioral regulation, again, we need to have those mental processes in place. We need these executive functions defined as self regulatory processes. Now, kids might be born with the ability to have these processes in place, but again, so much of this requires developing, interacting with the kids, teaching them. They have to learn the do's and don'ts. Okay, they have to learn the ability to inhibit a behavior or cognitive flexibility to be able to adapt to certain situations. Um, and so again, but are they born with this? And then even after childhood, how good are you at this? How good are you at managing your behavior and your, emotions when you're, in a conflict at work or when something tough happens in life or you don't get what you want and you start to get angry? So what we do is we structure kids to teach them, here's how you manage these behaviors when you're angry. You can't just go out and hit somebody, right? You're supposed to use your words and talk in a nice, kind way and then express yourself, right? These emotional, skills that we learn over time, but none of us are born with it. And again, how many of us are great at it when it comes throughout the life? Hence my initial comment, trajectory. That's the word. Look at the that's the T word. Look at the trajectory of your life and your emotional and behavior development. Have you even acquired these skills yet? I mean, I am so bad at it. All I can just think back to some silly fights that I've had with my wife when I was younger, even when I'm older, and I'm probably not too long from now, and I just find myself acting stupid, getting all insecure, not managing my behavior and my emotions very well. And so I'm constantly still, even at 40 years old, having to check myself. But again, at least I'm old enough to realize that that's not the trajectory I want for my life. I want to have more emotional balance and stability and be able to get along with others and, better so that I can make better friendships and have a better relationship with my wife, for example, okay? And whether or not I have these executive skills, I mean, I don't know. I probably didn't develop them enough as a child. But again, this kind of stuff helps, having siblings, for example. Having siblings and you having those conflicts and having to learn how to work together, how to deal with those emotions of not getting what you want, things along those lines. We're all confronted with these situations in our life. It's how do we cope with it? And so, how many coping skills do kids really have? Again, these executive function skills gradually emerge during early childhood and continue to develop through childhood and adolescence. And then that's the book. And then remember that then continues all the way across the trajectory of your entire lifespan. We are always evolving and developing these executive skills, better ways. And again, is that why wisdom maybe comes later at life? Because maybe it takes that many years to really solidify so many of our executive functions over our own behavior and emotions and the ability to interact with others, okay? Like many cognitive changes, brain maturation, especially the prefrontal cortex, along with the experiences someone has in their life, influence the development of your skills. So again, think about the brain growth, thinking patterns, neural pathways of thinking. All of these evolve over time, as does our emotional intelligence. Okay, so not only is our general crystallized and fluid intelligence growing, but also our emotional intelligence is growing. We're not born with this. This takes experiences. This takes learning how to be human with our human brain and then our body learning to deal with our brain inside this body and the body working with the brain. And again, it's just so complex being human. Then you got to deal with all these emotions that are just spewing out of your hippocampus, and you have all these inner drives and motivations that you have to check because they're not acceptable in modern times or in society or whatever it is. Okay, but again, as executive functions improve, children become less impulsive. Same thing with adults. Like, yes, we have our inner self, our biological self, just spewing out like, I'm hungry, I want sex, I want companionship, I want fun. But, we also learn to have more control over our unconscious mind and our endocrine system that is talking to our nervous system. Again, that's the body talking to the brain, and the brain responds to what the body wants, as we all experience in our life. When we're hungry, it's because our body tells our brain we're hungry, then our brain tells our conscious mind to go get food, and then next thing you know, we're walking up at McDonald's. But again, with all the kids, you have to realize again that, are we a blank slate as kids? The social context is going to structure our behavior. And then you could look at like Chomsky's theories of whether or not we all have these capacities to develop that wisdom, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self actualization, to be able to reach that epitome of our behavioral and emotional regulation and being able to manage our body and our brain and everything working together. But again, this is an ongoing skill that you're not born with, okay? Children show higher executive function skills when parents are warm and responsive, use scaffolding when the child is trying to solve a problem, and provide cognitively stimulating environments. Again, the social context you grow up in, the culture you grow up in, your parenting styles, the people you're exposed to, all of these things, along with your individual abilities, skills, knowledge, both those that you're born with and then those that you learn over time, all of this plays a role in our overall development. So again, it's very complex to take a biopsychosocial approach, but that's the only way to do it. So when do children start self-regulating? Again, this behavioral and emotional and even cognitive, just thinking, managing our thoughts. When does this develop? Children start regulating their behaviors in infancy, beginning with physiological regulation. As we talked about, kids learn the patterns of the people they're with or the culture they're with, and they start to adjust their sleeping patterns and crying and eating and things along with the social context. As infants move into toddlerhood, they are faced with the challenge of regulating their behavior as it relates to others in social situations. Again, this is kids having to go out and learn how to play. You know, it's like when you look at dogs, it's important to socialize dogs so that they're, know how to be around people and other animals. Same thing goes for kids. When we don't get that, type of socialization that's required to develop our skills, what happens? Again, if you don't interact with the child at all, they end up feral and they end up having impaired development across the lifespan. Okay, but again, as children interact in the social context and they begin to interact not just with their parents and their siblings, but other people, they have to learn how to get along, is one way of putting it. And a sociology approach would be they all have to learn the social norms and learn to conform their behaviors to meet the norms and expectations of culture. But again, from a psychological development, again, we are structuring our brain, our thought patterns, our emotions to then meet those needs of the social context to enable us not only to survive in the social world, but also to thrive. Okay, but again, remember, it's hard. It's hard developing these skills, okay? Look at how much we all still struggle even when we're adults. There's a reason there's psychologists, because people sometimes struggle with having to cope with just being human at times. And how do you think kids feel? It's all so new. They're just now born into this brain and body, and they're trying to use both and figure out the world and, grow their brains so they can get around in it. And then being able to deal with how it feels and their emotions. I mean, it's not easy. Do temper tantrums just go away? But that's kind of the idea. Like, as we interact and we learn to play with our friends, we learn that you can't just freak out and hit people and get all mad every time something happens, but again, you're not born with this. You have to learn it, right? So this type of self-regulation is typically not seen with any degree of consistency until, again, about age 2, which is kind of ironic because that's when they say the terrible twos start, right? I mean, but it should be the opposite. Like, they should be starting to self-regulate by 2. But as you can see, really when kids do a great job of starting to self-regulate is when they get to like 5, 6, 7. Yes, they're still crying and they're feeling their stuff, but you can totally watch them having to work on it. Like, my daughter's always just like, I need a minute. And she has to like go take a minute. I don't know. I think her mom taught her to like, maybe you need a minute or something. So she has to go take her minute and go have her tears, and then she can come back and talk about it or whatever. That's just whatever coping skill that she's developed, probably from her mother and being socialized into that way. But by about 7, they're getting pretty good at it. By teenagers, they're supposed to be a lot better at it, but we all know how that goes. So, I mean, seriously, just think about when you were a teenager and how many freakouts you had, and then did that really end when you became an adult? It could just be that our awareness of it grows, and maybe we don't ever get better at it, but maybe we do. I'm just saying. Yeah, it probably gets easier. Maybe it gets easier to cope with life with age, but maybe it doesn't get easier to cope with life with age. Again, that's the back and forth philosophical debate. All right, so the capacity to self regulate may develop earlier. And again, depending upon the social context, who you're exposed to, how you are taught, again, your parenting styles, you can develop it earlier. And then the book says it depends on developmental progress in other areas such as cognition and working memory. How adaptive and advanced are you? That helps children become aware of what's socially acceptable. A child's temperament. Think about how your temperament and your personality that's developing, how is that associated with how you feel and how you act on your feelings? Again, the quality of parent-child interactions and also the type. Again, looking at parenting types, and then the quality of the general home or school environment. Because again, kids growing up in poverty and rough environments, how is that associated with your development? Is it associated with more behavioral risks, less intelligence development? Again, it's not things like your race or your biological sex that's associated with intelligence, but socioeconomic status, being able to go to a good school, parents having a good job, living in a nice neighborhood, going to places where you're getting hit with challenging information, where you're being really pushed. This kind of stuff is very important to development. And that's how you end up with inequality in development. Because again, if as we when we talk about Vygotsky in a second, if society doesn't invest in that kid will never grow into what they can be on their own. So it does require that social investment, whether it's your immediate primary agents of socialization like parents, siblings, grandparents, or even if it's secondary agents like the education system. The quality of that is associated with how well you develop. And that's the sad reality of life. Life is not fair. Not every kid has an equal shot to develop and advance because we're not investing in every kid equally. The benefits of behavioral self regulation, again, internalization of what you're socialized. Again, so the socialization process involves both teaching and learning. It involves teaching information, but also internalizing that information for whoever is doing the learning. So, internalization represents a child's acceptance and understanding of and willingness to behave to conform to the social norms. Okay? And so, again, as we internalize our culture and we learn the do's and the don'ts, the rights and the wrong, morality, cultural norms, whatever words you want to use to describe it, we then conform our behavior to that, which makes it easier for us to have agency in the social context and being able to walk around. Being good at behavioral self regulation compared to having difficulty regulating one's behavior is associated with numerous positive outcomes for children. Again, as I'm saying, more success in school and academic achievement, higher levels of social competency and emotional intelligence and cognitive skills, peer based relationships, less problems expressing your anger and expressing your emotions, higher levels of pro social behavior, being able to interact with others in a positive way. Okay? Emotional self regulation. Again, we separate kind of behavior from emotion because you often think about behavior as how you're acting in the social context, and then emotions as more of an internal process. And then your behavior is kind of you acting on your emotions, so to speak, or on your cognitions or whatever it might be. But emotional self regulation refers to an individual's ability to recognize and name how they were feeling and to express their emotions constructively. And again, you're going to find that emotional intelligence tends to be higher for females. Why? Is it biology or is it culture? Are girls born with a more advanced, more developed emotional structure in their brains than boys are? Or is it the social context? And that we don't enable boys to get in touch with their emotions and talk about their feelings, that we stigmatize men for doing this. And so as a result, they're not developing as much emotionally. And is that why maybe men struggle with anger and aggression can be more difficult and expressed maybe more because they're not using their words, and maybe that's associated with violence against women or whatever it might be. Um, But there are significant differences generally in intelligence between the sexes when it comes to emotions. And is that why? How much of that's the cultural socialization, the structuring of the individuals, and how much is it the individual, their temperament, and the brain itself? But in general, again, this idea of learning emotional regulation, this takes time. Look at any toddler, look at any preschool kid, look at any teenager, look at any adult. We are still learning how to cope with our emotions, to be able to express our emotions, to label how we're feeling, to apply words to describe how we're feeling. Again, it's a big process. So adaptive emotion regulation involves staying in touch with how you are genuinely feeling at the time while making decisions about how you're going to express those feelings. Again, those are the book's words for basically saying that we have to learn to cope with our emotions, recognize how we're feeling, and learn how to express them in a culturally acceptable way. We don't have to abide by the norms of the culture. The dude doesn't have to abide. But again, generally, to get along with other people, we kind of have to play the game, which means I can't run around screaming at people just because I'm angry at them. I have to find a more socially appropriate way of expressing myself. 3 and 4 year olds learn new ways of expressing their feelings verbally. Again, once those language processes really start to get set in stone, and then they can use language to express themselves, but that doesn't, the full fluidity of language, kids by about 5 have a pretty much adult like language, okay? Like they have enough words to be able to describe what they're feeling. So, how long does it really take to be able to do that? Again, by 5, it's pretty solid. 3, 4, they're starting to rock it. But again, it's still something that goes on throughout the life. And then again, how do we learn to cope with our negative emotions? How do kids do that? By 5 or so, they can put their heads down to reduce sensory inputs that may be overwhelming. They might talk out loud to reassure themselves that they'll be okay. I just picture my daughter doing that. She's always talking to herself, like talking herself down, and it cracks me up. They recalibrate their goals or desires to match the options so they can help with their emotions and realize what they want. It's not going to happen. You're not going to get that toy. So you just have to learn to maybe think about something else you might want. you know. These strategies and others reduce the frequency and severity of tantrums, feelings of loneliness, and other unpleasant emotional responses. So, again, as we learn to emotionally regulate, as our emotional intelligence develops, we have more strategies for coping with our emotions. We're better able to recognize it, we're better able to label it, and then we're able to describe how we're feeling and then express it in a more appropriate way. The better off we tend to be when it comes to being able to interact with others. Okay. It also helps children remain calm when they are excited or happy, so it's not always just a sad time. Like my daughter gets super excited. Like the other day, I bought her some Rainbow Friends toy, and she's just in Target, like hugging me and just so excited. And I'm just like, it's a toy. But is that even appropriate? Like to be super excited in the store? I mean, should we be more quiet? You know what I mean? But whatever. The benefits of emotional self-regulation, again, just like behavioral regulation, the same cognitive processes are involved with executive functions, learning response initiation, inhibition. Again, how do we respond properly? How do we block responses that we shouldn't be having? Delayed gratification, learning to be patient, learning to be wait, not having to rush in, effortful control, cognitive flexibility, being able to be adaptive. All of these are good strategies for regulating children's emotions. Again, caretakers and those that are socializing you, those in your primary and secondary agents of socialization, they can help facilitate adaptive behavior by using goal-focused language, validating children's goals and preferences, explaining why somebody should do something for pro-social reasons, for example, just being patient with your kids. Compared with children with poor behavioral regulation skills, those who learn adaptive behavioral and emotional regulation strategies tend to learn more, like school better, and are disciplined less frequently. And again, that's, can they play the game better? Again, as we develop the ability to behave in a way that's socially appropriate, even again, in what we say is socially appropriate, remember that's all relative, depending upon the culture you live in. Like in modern times, you don't teach your kids to hit. But if I were a Viking, would I be teaching my kids to go over to England and rape and pillage and kill all the priests? So again, what is culturally relative depends on the culture, the time, the epoch. But again, just as a general, I keep talking about just this idea is We have to learn to work within the cultural norms to be able to work in the society that we live in, I guess. Okay. But again, if you learn these skills, it reduces anxiety and stress because they're able to get in the world better. They have more empathy for other people because they understand them better. They're better able to get along with parents, teachers, and peers because, again, they can play the game better. Are we not teaching our kids to play the game? About halfway through the chapter, the book breaks and starts talking about social and emotional competency, which is really what we're talking about. Becoming behaviorally and emotionally competent, being able to express ourselves and deal with life as it is, takes skills. It takes time, it takes experience. The book talks about the conscience, okay, or your sense of moral development. Again, you're not born with that. You have to learn that. Yes, you might come up with ideas on your own individually for what you think is right and wrong, but generally, again, you internalize the norms of your society, which contain the elements of culture like ideologies, values, belief systems, morality, what's right, what's wrong. Most of this you've internalized, and then you adapt your behavior, you conform to meet those needs of expectations of society. So kids are constantly internalizing right and wrong and then adjusting their behavior to meet that. So again, the book says that it consists of cognitive, emotional, and social influences that cause young children to create and act consistently with internalized standards of right and wrong. Again, these internalized standards, these are the cultural norms that we're taught by our parents. We learn how we're supposed to act, behave when we sit down at the restaurant. Don't put your feet on the chair. Don't be too loud. Don't slurp your drink. Use a napkin. Don't get chocolate all over your face. All of these things. That reminds me of the Seinfeld episode where George is at Wimbledon or a tennis tournament, I guess the U.S. Open, and they take a picture of him or the camera zooms in on him and he's just scarfing down a banana split and chocolate is all over his face and his girlfriend sees it on TV. But again, is our sense of morality a biopsychosocial process? Because you can argue evolutionarily that we all share, for example. Like it's built into us to share. So how much of morality is biological, built into our DNA, that we know we have to learn to work in groups, so then, that could be built into us. How much of morality is just your observations and then your own thoughts about what you think is right and wrong? And then how much of morality and your conscious, evolving of your conscious uh, understanding of what is right and wrong is a socialized process in which you are taught and then you internalize that knowledge, okay? So conscious development expands as young children begin to represent moral values and think of themselves as moral beings. As you internalize the morality of society, the culture, again, you justify your goodness of whether or not you are living within those parameters that are established by the culture you live in. So again, think about how you judge your life. You look to society to say, am I living up to these expectations? Same thing with self-esteem. You're highly influenced by how you think other people feel about you and whether or not you're meeting the needs of the social roles you play or, the culture that you live in. By the end of preschool years, for example, young children develop a moral self by which they think of themselves as people who want to do the right thing, who feel badly after misbehaving. At what point do we develop that sense of guilt when we hurt our friend? You know what I mean? And how much of that sense of guilt that we feel when we hurt our friend is built into our biology? Again, there's a reason we feel these emotions. Emotions are neurons releasing neurotransmitters. So much of our ability to have emotions is built into our biology. Why do we have emotions in the first place is an awesome question. That has to have a purpose, right? Something that has to do with our evolutionary survival across thousands and millions of years. Okay, so I mean, this type of human that we are now is pretty recent, like 350,000 years. But again, bipedal human-like types have been around for millions of years. So again, this DNA process of caring and empathy, these are all part of us. We all have this ability to do that. And then it starts to solidify again around, your preschool ages, 5, 6, 7. And then between 7 and 12, those kids are like perfect angels. And then all of a sudden they turn into teenagers and it's like, "Prah," and everyone always makes jokes or stigmatizes teenagers because their hormones are going wild or whatever it might be. But again, there is that process. In the development of conscience, young children become more socially and emotionally competent in a manner that provides a foundation for later moral conduct. Again, we are all learning the expectations of society over time, and we are internalizing that morality, and then we are trying to live it out. So play and symbols. Again, if you think about things like play, why does play exist? Why does play exist across so many species? And an evolutionary argument is it helps children practice their skills, experiment in the social context, and solidify new schematic knowledge that they're developing. And again, schematic knowledge are like skyscrapers or file cabinets of information that we organize in our brain as memories, and that we can retrieve that knowledge anytime. But again, kids aren't born with knowledge, so over time they have to develop these skills, and so play is a way that they're able to do that. Same thing with things like pretending. They're able to take on the roles, use objects, imagine how they can be used. All of this develops their executive functions. Play is also tied in with this idea of symbols, and that they learn the meanings attached to objects. And when they learn the meanings attached to the objects, then they go out and they use these meanings. In certain ways. Like, so they learn the meaning of what that hat means, then they put on that hat, and then they start acting like a police officer, for example. And then we all have these symbolic capacities, the ability to use language, which essentially is just symbols or sounds that represent something, symbolize something, in order to interact in the social context. And by engaging in games, for example, we're able to interact and try out new things and evolve and develop our brains. Okay? So, play and executive function. Mental representations are also key to the advances in executive function. Our ability to picture things in our mind, to be able to play out certain roles, to be able to just cognitively, apprise situations and decide how we're supposed to act and learn these ways, all of that's built into it. When children can learn to hold goals in their minds that are different from just the random spontaneous ideas like I am hungry that pop into your head, and being able to focus and being able to creatively act out that game. Think about how involving that truly is. I mean, it's like writing a story and then being able to conceptualize all the chapters in a story from beginning to end and live that out. Kids aren't born with that ability. You have to learn it. You have to develop it, okay? Young children show an outpouring of representational activities, including using language, pretend play, storytelling, singing, drawing, looking at photos, discussing the past and present, because they're trying to make sense of reality. Essentially, and is our brain driven to take in stimuli and then organize that stimuli and then act upon your knowledge? It is. It's built into our DNA. Kids love to engage in problem solving behavior. Why is problem solving part of being human? But again, why does the conscious mind exist if not to solve problems? The conscious mind reflects upon how you're feeling, what's going on in the world, how you're thinking, and then you can make decisions and choices, conscious choices, things you're aware of, instead of just being random like an animal and just going all based on instinct or whatever. We are human. We have that unique ability to use our conscious mind, okay? Limitations of executive function. Again, the book breaks down a couple concepts like egotist. These are the kind of the ideas. These are the things that basically separate kids from adults, to show you that yes, maybe we do kind of evolve in these stages, or at least it's a process. But egocentrism is the tendency of young children not to be able to take the perspective of others. It's hard for a young kid to put themselves in somebody else's mind. Perpetual salience. Children reason not based on what they know, but based on what they're seeing. Again, the book talks about if you put a Halloween mask on a parent, even with the parent's voice, the kids get very confused. During the pre-operational period, reasoning is based on empirical reality that is provided by the senses. Okay. Animism, they attribute lifelike qualities to objects, like the toys are tired. Like, oh, my toys are tired, I better put them to sleep and put a blanket over it. You see kids do it all the time. But why don't you really do that when you're an adult? You know what I mean? They kind of believe it, though. They do believe it. That's the point. Conservation slash centration. Understanding is dominated on a single feather, which is how the book describes it. But again, I like to think of it as the experiment where you take like different types of coffee mug sizes, but you put the same amount of water, and then you just, and you ask which one has more water. The kids, they look for like the biggest one or whatever. They just get kind of confused. Whereas an adult can realize that they all have the same amount of water. Classification errors. The book uses this example. you take 6 white and 4 black buttons, and you say, which is more, kid, the black buttons or the buttons? But the kid always compares black to white instead of thinking, oh, all the buttons are more. About ages 4 to 7, children begin to move toward logical thinking. They show some signs of logical reasoning, but they can't explain how or why they think as they do. Another critique of Piaget's theory, it lacks consideration for the role of cultural and socialization. This whole time I've been talking about cultural and socialization, but Piaget's theory really doesn't focus on it as much. Vygotsky does. I've just kind of been setting you up for the next slide, which again is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. And Vygotsky looks at all of those individual processes, but he really looks at how society, the socialization process, is also involved in cognitive, emotional, behavioral development. And again, Vygotsky's perfect example is children don't become rocket scientists on their own. Again, it takes all of us working with that kid, teaching that kid, structuring the kid, disciplining the kid, making that kid work and work and work to develop the skills necessary to do those kinds of complex equations, for example. So again, kids in the wild running around aren't going to become rocket scientists. We need like some kind of a structure, some way to socialize these kids so they can get access to the knowledge and then be able to somehow get that in their head. Because as we know with all kids, not every kid, even with the access to the knowledge, is going to want to put it in our head. Again, so that does take a lot of that social molding to be able to do that. So the idea is we as people, as a society, we socially mold kids. We structure their behavior. We also play a role in how well or how successful they develop and how much they develop. So Vygotsky's ideas are most recognized for identifying the role of social interaction and culture and developing these higher order thinking skills, these executive functions. Interdependence between individual and social processes in the construction of knowledge, in that knowledge is created through social interaction by working together, by teaching each other, by absorbing the knowledge of your culture. We share that. So again, that relationship between the individual and the culture, or the individual and society, and that yes, it's individuals that make up society, but then society then structures, the individual and our biological drives, because again, we can't just act on all of our biological drives. It's not socially appropriate. 3 themes often identified with Vygotsky's ideas of sociocultural learning are human development and learning originate in social, historical, and cultural interactions. Again, you can't separate the individual from the biology and the culture. The use of psychological tools, particular language, mediates the development of higher mental functions. Again, we use language to teach our kids. We use these symbols to get their brains going. And then learning occurs within the zone of proximal development. Again, not every kid has the same capacity for learning, but again, we all have the ability to live to our fullest as much as we can, to live our full capacity or be able to fulfill our full capacity, or again, self-actualization, like becoming that person where you're the fullest self you can, the most full of knowledge, the most developed, the most rocking your life. But again, we all have to live within our humanity. There are sounds dogs can't hear. They can hear that a human can't, for example. And humans can do math and a dog can't. We all have our own evolved processes to be able to get in the world. Sociocultural theory. So this is Vygotsky's theory. Again, it's this idea that the society and the culture you live in structure the way you think, behave, act, all of those factors. It emphasizes the importance of cultural and social interaction in the development of cognitive abilities. Vygotsky contended that thinking has social origins. Social interactions play a critical role, especially in the development of higher order thinking skills. Again, if we do not interact with kids, they do not develop. But if we as a society really invest in that kid, they will grow. Okay, and that's why I think a more balanced education system might just kind of help out with some of that inequality we have, but whatever. Cognitive development cannot be fully understood without considering the social context. So I would say you can't understand a person or their personality without understanding the. So Vygotsky calls guided participation, again, the socialization process. I mean, that's what I call it. I mean, so guided participation is like the psychological way of describing it. Sociological way of describing it would be socialization process. This is where a learner actively acquires new culturally valuable skills and capabilities through a meaningful collaborative activity with an assisting, with someone helping a more experienced other. Again, this is so complex for saying agents of socialization, parents, peers, education system, whatever it might be in the social context, they teach you a bunch of stuff. You then internalize that information. Easiest way to think about it. So language. Language is a developmental tool. Again, we use these words, symbols to be able to teach kids information. Children use schemas, again, these categories of knowledge that they construct and organize on the mental plane. But for Vygotsky, language was a social medium. It's the mechanism through which we build knowledge of the world. We use our language to teach and learn, and then we internalize that information, and then later on in life, we then teach that for the next generation, right? He believed that with development, the language we acquire from our environment shapes the ways in which we think and behave. With development, language becomes internalized as thought, cognition, or reasoning, and children use this internalized language to guide their action. Again, if you look at Freud's theory of the self, you have the I, your inner self, your biological self, the superego, your social self that's aware of all the norms and culture, and then your ego, the voice in your head working between the two, for example. But again, that's not how you get to the world. You just kind of think and look, and then you feel, and then you observe, and then so scaffolding, again, how do we teach children? Again, do you teach it in pieces, little parts of the whole, for example? When they're kids, we learn 1 plus 1, 1 minus 1. Then we learn equations where we start to combine that. Then we add multiplication. And then before you know it, you're doing algebra, which is a mix of all of that in one sentence, okay? And so again, for kids to be able to learn the ability to do algebra, it's a slower process. Kids don't know algebra. That's just random arbitrary symbols that we apply. We have to teach kids what those symbols mean, and then they have to learn to be able to use it. Like the number 1 doesn't exist in nature. Humans just created it. We drew a line and we just tell kids that's number 1 and this is what it means. And eventually you figure that out. So Vygotsky differed with Piaget in that he believed that a person not only has a set of actual abilities, but also a set of potential abilities like math. Like you're not born with the actual ability to do math, you're born with the potential ability to do that. And that can be realized if you're given guidance from others, or again, if you're socialized to learn the skills that mathematics require. He believed that through guided participation, known as scaffolding, or the socialization process of information, with a teacher or a capable peer, a child can learn cognitive skills within a certain range known as the zone of proximal development. Again, within their capacity to learn. But how do we maximize that? How do we maximize the amount of information they are learning so that they can fill their abilities to capacity? I guess I just keep playing with these words, but it's probably the best way to say it. So sociocultural theory, Vygotsky's theory emphasizes how cognitive development proceeds as a result of social interactions. It's by interacting in society that we get the stimuli we need to internalize into our brains for our brains to grow. And again, we use language as the main medium by which we interact in the world. And the zone of proximal development is defined as what a learner can do with help from more competent others. It sits in the gap between what a learner can do alone without help and what the learner cannot yet do. And then the theory of mind, just to kind of finish this out. Again, the theory of mind is your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And at what age does that exist? Like when you can kind of imagine what somebody else is thinking. That's the theory of mind. And the book says it begins about age 2. I say it's pretty much solidified by 5. By 5, you can kind of put yourself in the mind of your doll and imagine how the doll is feeling about you. Okay. But same thing, you can put you hurt your friend, you can empathize with them. You can imagine what they're experiencing, right? So that happens by about 5. So between 3 and 5 is what the book says. The theory of mind refers to the ability to think about other people's thoughts, also known as metacognition. That is thinking about thinking. Okay. So again, you're thinking about how somebody else is thinking about you. For example, that ability, comes about that age. Theory of mind is the understanding that other people experience mental states for existence, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, or desires that are different from our own, and that their mental states are what guide their behavior, and that we're not always on the same page. Again, you got to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. This skill, which emerges in early adulthood, the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, helps humans to infer, predict, and understand the reactions of others. Again, why is it built into us to even care what other people think? because that's part of group behavior. If we have a sense of how they're thinking, we can kind of predict what they're doing, then we can better work together. Again, this idea of promoting competent social interactions, the ability to work together in a successful way. Language development does vary by culture. Vocabulary growth by ages 2 to 6, kids learn from 200 words to 10,000 words by age 6. Then you have some multiple linguistic speakers that will learn 20,000 words, 30,000 words. It goes up a lot. The vocabulary spurt involves 10 to 20 new words per week and is accomplished through a process called fast mapping. But again, fast mapping again is internalizing that information, encoding it in the language schema so that you can then retrieve it and then use those symbols to make sense of what you're trying to say, or to understand what somebody else is trying to say, or the information or the meaning they're trying to infer upon you. Grammar rules generally are learned over time. Even the kids that when they start to make mistakes, like your book talks about overregulation, like putting ed on the end of anything, like I goed or I doed. We learn over time that that's not appropriate. And then we also learn new words to say instead of I goed, I went, or I will go, things like that. But kids need trained, but grammar does come naturally by using language. And then bilingualism, just to finish it out, the book talks about how the majority of the world is bilingual. It talks about some of the pros and cons of being bilingual. And whether or not it's associated with cognitive growth is debatable. So there's been some pros, like yes, it causes more cognitive development, but at the same time, people who speak more than one language tend to not. It might affect their SAT scores because of various reasons, like it's not their native language, or they have so many languages going on that their understanding of one language might not be as specific as other people who only speak that one language. Then the book does finish out talking about just some of the suggestions of how we can better care for kids to help with their development, especially during these ages of early childhood development. Positive and caring relationships among children and adults. The curriculum having something that's strong in emotional, physical language, cognitive areas, not just letting them slide by, but really making them work. Giving them information and feedback about learning and development. Protecting their health and nutrition. Having quality teachers and agents of socialization. Collaborative relationships, both institutionally and with families and friends, indoor and outdoor environments, so you have a little bit of everything, leadership and management personnel that actually are skilled too to be able to structure the organization definitely help. But again, thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.